It's me again. Hello and welcome to Housing Works Bookstore Cafe on this beautiful Sunday afternoon. We're thrilled to be here celebrating Sarah Smarsh's first book, Heartland, with the author and very special guest today, Chelsea Clinton. Before we get started, could you raise your hand if this is the first time that you've been to the bookstore? That's awesome, cool. Well, welcome. I hope that this is not the last time. We're a very, very special space. We're an all-donation bookstore. We're mainly run by volunteers. All the money that we raise funds Housing Works' mission to end the dual crises of AIDS and homelessness in New York City, and we've been doing this work since the mid-90s in response to the AIDS crisis in New York. We continue to help people by providing housing and healthcare, harm reduction services. We're working on safe injection sites. We have many, many thrift stores which do a similar thing to the bookstores, but with furniture and clothes. So if you're ever looking to get rid of pre-loved items, please bring them to us. Everything that we sell helps the mission, including everything that we sell in the cafe and at today's delightful mimosa bar. So I do encourage you to stick around afterwards, obviously to buy Sarah's book, but also to buy some books in the store, maybe to have a drink or a coffee or a pastry, explore the store, get a sense of what we're about. You can visit our website to learn about all of the other events we do. We have 4 more events this week, ranging from science fiction to politics. So we like to think we do something for everybody. And I'm also very happy to talk to any of you about doing an event. You can talk to me afterwards about that, about volunteering with us, which is a very fulfilling way to contribute to the organization, about having weddings with us, which we have almost every weekend. We're a very, very flexible space. We're a community space. It's very important to us to be somewhere for everybody. So welcome to the family, and please stick around. But for now, I'm going to introduce our 2 fabulous guests for today, starting with Sarah Smarsh. Sarah Smarsh's widely circulated pieces on socioeconomic inequality and the working poor have been published by The Guardian, The New York Times, Pacific Standard, The Cut, and many others. She is a frequent commentator on class issues in the US, and recently was a research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Heartland, a memoir of working hard and being broke in the richest country on earth, is her first book. She lives in Kansas, and you can follow her on Twitter at Sarah_Smarsh. Sarah is joined today by Chelsea Clinton, author of the #1 New York Times bestselling picture book, She Persisted, 13 American Women Who Changed the World, which was praised in a star review by Publishers Weekly as a lovely, moving work of children's literature. She is also the author of another New York Times bestselling, She Persisted Around the World, 13 Women Who Changed History. It's your world, get informed, get inspired, and get going. And with Devi Svedha, Governing Global Health, Who Runs the World and Why? She's the vice chair of the Clinton Foundation, where she works on many initiatives, including those that help to empower the next generation of leaders. Chelsea lives in New York City with her family, and their dog Soren, cute. You can follow her on Twitter as well at Chelsea Clinton. So please join me in giving a very, very warm welcome this morning to Sarah Smarsh and Chelsea Clinton.
Hi, everybody.
Good morning, everyone. Or I guess maybe now technically good afternoon. I think that Sarah is going to read for us. But before she does, I just really want to say thank you to Rosie and Housing Works for hosting our conversation today. I want to underscore emphatically everything that Rosie said about the importance of Housing Works' mission and work here in New York City. And so I hope that for those of you who raised your hands saying that this is the first time that you've been to the cafe, I certainly hope that it won't be the last. I'm incredibly grateful to have the chance to share the stage with Sarah. I met Sarah for the first time about 20 minutes ago, but I first encountered her work when I read her gripping and deeply troubling piece on the predatory plasma industry in our country. And since then have been an avid follower of not only her work on Twitter, but the other places that it appears. And I have been lucky enough to read Heartland. I had pre-ordered a copy. And then when we had the chance to have this conversation in anticipation of it, I got another copy. So my husband took my Amazon copy, and I got my publisher's copy. And we both have just been swept away this week. So I hope that after you hear Sarah read, you'll understand a little bit about kind of why that was the inevitable consequence of being lucky enough to read her words and have them reverberate around our heads and our hearts. And then we'll have a little bit of a conversation, and then we'll open it up to your questions. But now for the woman of the hour, Sarah.
Thank you. I'm, of course, incredibly humbled to be sharing a stage with Chelsea. We were born the same year, which I know because when I was a 12-year-old girl in a Kansas farmhouse watching the news, she was a 12-year-old girl in the White House on my television. So what an honor to be here, and thanks to Housing Works also. So I'm just going to read a short bit from Heartland. This is a book about class. That's what I write about. But it's also a book about place, which has everything to do with class in this very large geographic country. So it's actually, I thought it might make sense for the audience to tell you about my first ever visit to New York City. So I grew up on a farm about 30 miles west of Wichita. I grew up raising wheat and feeding cattle. I was a child in the 1980s, so it was just before the internet, and we didn't have even air conditioning or cable TV. So in some ways, it was more like a 1950s upbringing than a 2000s upbringing. And so I just say that to provide context for what an incredible moment it was when I qualified for a national contest through my public school that brought me to New York as a teenager. So this is from chapter 3 of Heartland. It's called A Stretch of Gravel with Wheat on Either Side, which is very much about this supposed urban-rural divide that is a feature of our country. And I actually take great issue with that framework and think it's misleading in many ways. And maybe you'll see why in this passage. When you hear me use the second person, know that I'm addressing a would-be child who doesn't exist, a would-be daughter. If I live to be an old woman and the trends of my early life continue, by the time I die, half the Kansas population will live in only 5 of 105 counties. People consolidated like seed companies. There's a strength in that. Environmentalists and economists might suggest, but perhaps a greater weakness. President Dwight Eisenhower, a native of rural Kansas, said, "Whatever America hopes to bring to pass in the world must first come to pass in the heart of America. The countryside is no more our nation's heart than are its cities, and rural people aren't more noble and dignified for their dirty work in fields. But to devalue in our social investments, the people who tend crops and livestock, or to refer to their place as flyover country, is to forget not just a country's foundation, but its connection to the earth, to cycles of life scarcely witnessed and ill understood in concrete landscapes." For Wendell Berry's vision of a sustainable world, that's referring to an earlier passage about him, one in balance both economically and environmentally, the American heart needs a strong, well-supported, well-respected chamber outside its metropolis. The life force that flows back into it will likely be from other places. The meatpacking towns of western Kansas, for instance, have become some of the most ethnically diverse places in the country, as immigrants stream in from Mexico, the Middle East, and Central America to take factory jobs amid industrial agriculture's boom. Statewide, according to the 2010 census, many rural counties had declined, and more than 8 out of 10 Kansans were white. But the Hispanic population had grown by 60% in the last 10 years. That's a demographic shift not without tensions, but one that has been embraced by some small-town whites who knew their home must change to survive. As Europeans who moved west and built sod houses on the prairie learned, you either work together or starve alone. Of all the gifts and challenges of rural life, one of its most wonderful paradoxes is that closeness, born of our biggest spaces. A deep intimacy forced not by the proximity of rows of apartments, but by having only one neighbor within 3 miles to help when you're sick, when your tractor's down and you need a ride, when the snow starts drifting so you check on the old woman with the mean dog regardless of whether you like her. When I was a teenager in 1996, I went to New York City for the first time to compete in a national communications contest I'd qualified for from my tiny rural high school. We visited the Statue of Liberty, which I was excited to climb inside. As I neared the crown, ascending a narrow, winding staircase with hundreds of people packed in front of me and behind me, I suddenly had trouble breathing. I wasn't afraid of heights, but terror rose up in me as I looked around and realized I couldn't get out if I had to. I didn't know it, but I was having a panic attack. Maybe not an altogether irrational one, but resulting from claustrophobia I'd never been anywhere crowded enough to know that I had. While the small space echoed with many voices, I closed my eyes and took deep breaths. I turned to the stranger behind me and looked him in the eyes like we were the only 2 people on Earth. He was from Boston, as I recall. I asked if he wanted to take a psychological quiz. Panic was coursing through me, making my lungs and muscles feel tight and clenched, but I must have hidden it well enough. My voice sounded steady. The man laughed and said, "Okay." I told him a long story about him on a journey by foot through a forest and meadows. I paused to ask him questions. What animal is on the other side of the wall of vines? What's in the water when you kneel next to the pond and look down? The concept was something I'd heard somewhere, a person leading someone else through a kind of mental maze, but mostly I made it all up. The crowd around us had gotten quiet to listen. He answered, and I told him what I thought his mind said about who he was. He and others nodded along. As for me, I had something to focus my mind on as we inched one suspended metal step at a time toward the crown of the Statue of Liberty. I had harnessed an inner calm that can be found anywhere, but that for me had been cultivated in rural lands under a state flag that bore the Latin phrase ad astra per aspera, to the stars through difficulties. When we got to the top, I wasn't scared anymore. Someone took my picture, a relieved smile, a view of New York Harbor behind me through the little windows that at night glow as jewels in her crown. That's how I'd come to resolve the tensions of my childhood, of my family members' lives, about country and city. I craved the opportunities that cities contained, and I'd pursue it. But most essential to my well-being was the unobstructed freedom of a flat, wide horizon. When I was well into adulthood, the United States developed the notion that a dividing line of class and geography separated 2 essentially different kinds of people. I knew that wasn't right because both sides existed in me, where I was from and what I hoped to do in life, the place that best sustained me, and the places I needed to go for the things I meant to do. Straddling that supposed line as I did, I knew it was about a difference of experience, not of humanity. You would have been born on one side of that perceived divide, but that wouldn't have predicted anything about the core of you. Not your politics, and most definitely not your character. It would have predicted the things you saw and did to some extent, and one defining psychological tension guaranteed by your country's economy. Every day, you would decide whether to stay, go, or try to go. And if you went, no matter where you ended up, like every immigrant, you'd still feel the invisible dirt of your motherland on the soles of your feet.
Now, I think I should have bought the audiobook version. May we all know ourselves as well as Sarah clearly has come to know herself, and may we all be blessed with the ability to articulate that so powerfully.
struck me in reading Heartland repeatedly was the kind of fact that Sarah spent more than 15 years writing this book, that she had labored on this over more than a third of her life. And so I thought we could start this afternoon with her just talking a little bit about the process of writing and whether or not this is the book that you always knew you would write, whether or not you started off writing it to your ephemeral daughter or your higher self, and kind of how did you go from kind of that first moment 15 years ago to this? I appreciate that question because, I think that at first glance one might think that this story was contrived for this political and cultural moment in our country, and that's hardly the case. I knew I was going to write this book as a kid, and I made basically every academic and professional decision toward its fruition, studying writing along the way. I worked as a journalist to pay the bills, and this has been tucked in drawers, and I tended to it when I had the resources of time. Along the way, I was interviewing my family members, taking research grants to do archival research to piece together the story of my family, which was quite an undertaking because poverty has a way of erasing place and dates, and it's just a kind of ill-documented experience often. And so I always knew that I wanted to tell a story about my family. I'm approaching in that passage I read to you a moment when I arrived on a college campus as not just a first-generation college student, but the first member of my household to finish high school. And so when I was on that college campus and I already knew that I wanted to tell the stories of my family just at a gut level, I started getting an initial sense of why it might matter, and that was my otherness in so many ways. By the way, I did my undergraduate at the University of Kansas, and even in the context of KU, most people in Kansas are not farmers, by the way, and so I'm just sort of like embody a stereotype that the country might have about my place. So even at KU, at a state university, the fact that I was poor, came from a household where people didn't finish high school, and women and girls had babies as teenagers for generations before me, all these things made me realize that there was something about my family story that had a public significance. And then over the course of my work as a journalist, I found the language to articulate what that was.
And I think it's remarkably brave, not only for you, Sarah, to share such an intimate look at your family, but also for your family. And that your family clearly was part of this 15-plus year journey, too. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because when you're kind of in your journalism posture, as a journalist, you're probably interviewing people on the outskirts of an event, or that you have found to, illuminate kind of a larger issue that you think deserves more attention. That's very different than kind of interviewing and cataloging the letters of your family members.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was an intense process, and I was in my 20s for much of it, so it was also, of course, a very internal, cathartic sort of thing. But as far as just the work of it, my family, the culture that I come from, I always hesitate to generalize, but I think it's largely true that I'm from a place that it's German, Catholic, Midwestern farmers. It's a very stoic, severe culture that does not pause to reflect or, ask a child how they feel. A lot of love, but it is a different presentation of it, and no one's in therapy they can't afford it and wouldn't have the time to do it if they wanted to. And so I was arriving asking them questions about their deepest, darkest secrets in, a way that was not only strange because of our connection as family members, but because they had never asked those questions themselves. And that really gets at the heart of this book, which is validating the stories of people who have not seen their own lives or stories or meanings reflected necessarily in popular culture or news media. And the way I got them to open up, which it took me a while to figure out, was I just said, I'm doing my work. And, they're farmers and carpenters, and they work in retail stock rooms and factory floors. And none of them have ever had the privilege of the sort of profession that I'm in. But they understand work, and they might be suspicious about touchy-feely questions, but if I showed up with my journalist cap on and just very formalized the process, hit play, it's not a family that keeps secrets. It's just a family that was never forthcoming because they didn't think anybody cared.
One of the kind of real through lines that you've already touched on is giving dignity where dignity's always existed, right? You don't have to kind of grant that dignity. You have to, in some ways, expose it and amplify it. And I was really struck when even, talking about the kind of dark currents of addiction or abuse, that you never kind of isolated or otherized that. And I think that's particularly important in this moment, and you talk about how this has touched your own family, of our opioid crisis. And particularly since Rosie was talking about the work increasingly that Housing Works is doing here to push for safe injection sites and kind of normalize harm reduction. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you kind of navigated that internally, of kind of what you have understood is wrong, while also not kind of displacing it from the lived experience, and then what our social responsibility is, and then how you translate that into your writing.
Yeah. I think what you're getting at is one of the great challenges of journalism, which is often a much more short form of writing, and there's just less space for nuance. And so often that can result in a just kind of hyper focus on say a crisis within a community that renders invisible all of its joy and humor and love. And even if that reporting is done with concern, inherent in that is a kind of dehumanization. So I think that I've always been very sensitive to that particular issue as a journalist, because I'm in an industry that often is sort of selling short the very people that I know and love, to my mind. But I think that the way that I got around that in this book was just to tell a robust, comprehensive story. And so I think that when you take, say, my stepmother, who struggled with opioid substance abuse disorder, and you take my father's drinking and gambling habits, or my mother's most angry moments, when they are folded into the context of our family also bravely facing challenges and having wild fun times on the farm when it snowed and my grandpa tied a canoe to the back of a truck and pulled us through a wheat field, then those the scars and the mars are revealed as just one piece of the puzzle.
But most people are not their worst moments.
Yeah.
Some people are, but most people aren't. One of the kind of choices you made as a writer that really struck me was how you went forward and backward in time. And each chapter felt so coherent, but sometimes we would end kind of in one phase of your life or your understanding of your family, and then we would kind of return or jump back. How did you think about time when you were kind of writing Heartland, and how important was it to you to sort of sublimate time to these larger kind of questions that you were tackling?
Yeah, time was a great conundrum in this book for many reasons. One is just we were talking earlier about the creative process. Since it spanned like 15 years, there's a passage in here about my grandma Betty threatening to whip up on a lady in a Walmart parking lot. And I literally wrote that for an English class in my rural high school. And then there are some long passages I wrote as a college student. And then, I guess what I'm saying is I transformed as a writer in some ways over the course of that time. And so that made for some challenges in making the book cohesive at the end. But what you're referring to as in terms of time's use in a structural sense, I did want there to be a loose chronology, and I think a loose one is present, but it also, each chapter is kind of devoted to a theme that intersects with rural life. So the first one is about economics and work, labor, pay. The second chapter is about the physical body, specifically as a female member of that class and place. The third chapter that I read from is about the concept of place on the earth. And so finding a way to, hone in on the anecdotes of a moment that fit with both the chronology and the theme was one of the great challenges of the book, to which my editor, who's in the audience, can attest, Kathy Belden. So,
yes, and I do want to take a moment to thank everyone who helped Heartland be the magnificent book it is. Being an author, I know that books are always a team sport, and so really just thank you to all of Sarah's team for helping her bring this into the world. You mentioned, that there are passages in here that you wrote in high school. There is nothing that I wrote in high school that would deserve to be in kind of any book that I have written or hope to write in the future. So clearly, kind of your gift presented early, and as you acknowledge, formally in the acknowledgments, you thank some of your teachers, and I also am aware deeply of how many of my teachers played a profound impact on shaping not only kind of my mind, but also really my character and my personhood. Could you talk a little bit about, since you went to many different schools, kind of the challenges of classes that intersects with education, and kind of the challenges of continuity there, and kind of why that was so important to you to include in the book?
Yeah, so the transience of the economic disadvantage I was born into meant that I attended 8 schools by the time I was in 9th grade. Now, the farm that I've referenced was kind of a grounding force throughout that time, and I moved permanently in with my grandparents there when I was 11. So that's how all that shook out. But public schools were so important in my life in myriad ways that have to do with that poverty and that transience. So the things that were lacking in my own family, I often I had access to them through only one institution, that was public education. My family couldn't afford babysitters or piano lessons or summer camp, or the only time that, particularly for a kid from a geographically isolated region in a pre-internet moment, the only time that I really encountered society proper was at school. And then, of course, I just by nature was a bookish kid, and so it was a place that I thrived. And there were great challenges there along the way. Poor kids often don't receive a teacher's favor, but I was an ambitious little kid, and I really harnessed that system to good effect, I think. But this is an extremely important question, because I always like to make sure that that my book is not perceived as or presented as some sort of individual triumph. I did work hard for many years, and some of those were like the years that others describe as their most carefree and fun, were for me the hardest years of my life, attempting to cross this so-called class divide. But it wasn't just the hard work. It was also blessings that I was born into and can take no credit for, like good health and a sound mind, and many social programs. I got qualified for free lunch in my public schools. I had teachers who my first byline was in 4th grade. I had a teacher at a school who mailed a little bit of memoir I wrote to a national children's magazine, and they published it. And that's the kind of thing that like my parents wouldn't even know to do or think to do or have time to do. And he, as an incredible teacher in the public school system, saw I was a kid from such a place, and he stepped in and played that role. So also when I was a first-generation college student at the University of Kansas, I was a straight-A college student, and I, honest to God, did not know what the term graduate school meant while I was on that campus. And so I encountered a federally funded program called the McNair Scholars Program, and they said, your butt needs to go to grad school. We will help you study for the GRE. You can come. I didn't have a computer. You can come in and use our computer. We'll pay for your application fees. And I got into the MFA program at Columbia University. So the course of my life was no doubt touched by education and specifically public education in a major way.
I had an extraordinary teacher in 4th grade too, named Mrs. Porter, who had a huge impact on my life. And so I just am thankful that you also had a great public school teacher, although again, Mrs. Porter was not sending my writing off to nationally syndicated children's magazines. So this is the last question that I will ask before opening it up. So I'm now putting you all on notice to think about kind of what questions you'd like to ask Sarah about kind of the substance or the process of Heartland or the larger issues it illuminates. You know, one thing I know that, and Sarah's referenced this already, and she's spoken about this in interviews that I kind of listened to and read in preparation for coming here, is that, you know, this is not a political book, and yet it clearly is deeply a public book, because she clearly kind of outlines throughout the book the ways in which different policy shifts at the national and state level affected her family, her home, her own life trajectory. And one of the things that really struck me in reading Heartland that we were talking about before coming out here is how important it was to her when she was in college to take a sociology class that for the first time really kind of illuminated for her this sort of cause and effect relationship between kind of, you know, public policy choices and real effect in her family and her community's lives. And so I wondered if Sarah, just while we're waiting kind of for people to gather their thoughts and questions, you could talk about kind of what you think the right answer would be for any young person, whether at the high school or college level should be. Sort of what class should everyone take in our country to try to help us understand cause and effect? What might that look like to you?
Mm-hmm. That's such a great question. So the class that sort of like dismantled any, I was raised with, I don't know, I suppose kind of like a moderate, slight conservatism, but really I'm just from like a apolitical bunch, mostly non-voters. They tend to hold pretty progressive views, but then have over the years been sort of, you know, vulnerable to a moderate conservatism as well. But really it was this class called the Sociology of Families that I took as a college student that just kind of like dismantled any idea I had about specifically economic policy, which, as you'll find in this book, is of particular interest to me as a writer on class. So, you know, I think that the importance of that class and what struck home to me, you know, so this is where I've encountered for the first time the data that says if you were born poor, you're likely going to stay poor. If you are black or brown, the odds are stacked against you economically just for that. But it framed it in the context of the family unit and experience, and that was where the research resided. So there was kind of an integration in that class of the public and private. So I think whatever is like the important class that should be part of an essential curriculum seeks that sort of integration. Because I think we often live, you know, we live our private and family lives in one sphere, and then there's this compartmentalization of our national discourse about politics and policy. Of course, we understand that they're connected, but rarely in a classroom setting or on cable news shows are we really getting at the human stories and how they play out in a way that reflects those public decisions. Yeah, so that's a great question.
Yeah, no, thank you, Sarah. So questions, and I can't, yes. Long hair, yes. I'm sorry I don't know anyone's name, so I will identify you by like hair or glasses or the color of the shirt you're wearing.
Certainly. And actually, what a great question. And sorry. So she asked, I was talking about some sort of what we perceive as upward mobility in our country, and that involves crossing some concept of a class divide or line. And she asked, would someone from, who was born at what we would envision as a higher rung on the ladder, can it go in the opposite direction for the sake of understanding? And certainly, and I think the important thing to understand in processing that idea is that we don't really leave one place and go to another, and we don't really leave a class and go to another, or, I think W.B. Du Bois had a phrase to describe his experience as being simultaneously a black man and a highly educated intellectual within the context of our country at his time, was like a dual consciousness. And I think that class is something that, I'm speaking with you all in a form of English that I learned through formal education. When I talk to my family, I sound very different. And I'm here among you in New York City, a place I love. My family is still very much, as we speak, living the more like the realities that are described in this book. And so I feel like I hold a sort of dual citizenship in a sense, which tells us that there's no one, when someone says she got out, I say, well, I live in Kansas still, and when I leave here, I'll get texts from my construction worker dad asking me how it went. And so life experience is not so compartmentalized. But I think that the beauty of your question of a concern for seeking to understand, I think that's the importance of stories and books. And the good ones hopefully allow for transcending our own private experience for the sake of understanding other people's humanity and our universal connections, and also the ways that our lives are sometimes woefully different. Thanks.
Great question. Yes, in the back, in the black and red, I think.
First, thank you so much for being here. I've been looking forward to this for so long. But so I have a very similar background to yours. You swap out the form for the forwards and backwards. And you spoke about working as a journalist. I'm a journalist too. And I wanted to ask you specifically about this phenomenon I've encountered working in newsrooms, especially post 2016. There was this sort of for a while, early 2017, late 2016, after the election, there was this sort of media impetus to blame what had happened on the white working class. So certainly we heard about it. So I find myself in these newsrooms surrounded by people who were like nice suburban kids who went to NYU, making fun of and sort of vilifying people that look like my mother or my father. And just dealing with that and dealing with that sort of rage and trying to handle that and live through that is something I was wondering if that is something that you have dealt with as someone from this background in these more rarefied media circles. Like, how do you not lose your shit doing it?
Thanks. So the questioner is from a similar background, and you said exchange farm for
Coal country, right?
coal country. Is that what?
Sorry.
Backwoods or like the Pine Barrens in South Jersey.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, because there's a version of my place in every state in this land, isn't there? And my version involved wheat fields, but it comes in many iterations. So the question is, how have I grappled with the kind of hyper fixation on what the national media now calls the white working class, which often is essentially pinning our current political situation on that group. That has been deeply personally painful for me as a member of the news media and someone who is from that place, and I'll tell you why. While I am never a Trump voter apologist, I am someone who wants to make sure that we take to task everyone who had a hand in the place that we've ended up, and that includes white people at every rung of the economic ladder. And so it has seemed to me sort of a convenient fixation by a largely upper middle class white media. on what happen to see as a scapegoat. On the ground in Kansas, which we paint as a red state, just like any place that is cast as either red or blue in this monochromatic way, there are people, there's a political diversity there. By the way, part of the problem of this framing is as though the whole working class is white. And, I read in that passage about the very large immigrant population in Kansas that is lost in these discussions. And the hell of it is that the people I come from aren't asking for that, and then I think that then there can be this anger, like, well, why are they getting all the attention? It's like, it's really, those narratives are being set in power centers and about a group of people that by definition do not have a voice in that same national discussion. So it's a very dangerous way, I think, to talk about our country. So for me, I'm just always trying to wave a flag about, well, not just nuance and complexity, but the hard numbers. So I don't know, like in most red states, about 40% of voters voted for Hillary Clinton. And to my mind, like 40% ain't nothing. And then they become invisible when then we talk about red states. They lose in the context of an electoral college, but they're there on the ground doing some of the most important work for progress, as far as I'm concerned. Thanks.
And I think one of the things that clearly I think Sarah did many wonderful things in this book. So just one of the other things I think that she does a very good job of is not fetishizing or romanticizing or infantilizing anyone, which I think circles back to the point of dignity and is essential to that question. Yes.
So I'm really a big fan of your work, and particularly of the way that you say, as you're saying right now, that we're not just red and blue states, we're not just black and white. So much of this does become part of the political conversation, and we can parse it out that the people don't see ourselves as very necessarily. The politicians use these terms and these labels to divide us, particularly those who are in power today. So I know as someone who has lived the benefit of various policies and who has studied these policies and written about them as a journalist, have you thought about creating policies and possibly running for office?
Oh my gosh. I think this is a question that should be asked of Chelsea, not me. I appreciate that, friend and grad school comrade. I think that like right after the 2016 election, like a lot of women, I just felt like this, like a fire rise up, and I thought very seriously about going into government. I don't have a law school degree, but maybe it would be a good thing for our country if you could access those spaces without one, and I thought maybe I would try. But then I think, I can probably be of best service as a storyteller, and with the platform I have now. So I don't have any intentions of doing that, but I hope that a lot of women and other minority groups in this room are considering it.
And I hope you ask her that question over time, in case the answer may change. Oh gosh. Yes, my glasses.
Given what you have acknowledged, and I think what we all see is kind of talk about your community, talk about and manipulation of your community, and I have so much admiration for the work that you're doing to sort of create change and to work against that, but I'm wondering what you think might happen or what others can do to actually help facilitate a change in that at scale. As there might be an opportunity for people who are, who are aware of the problems about how these stories are told and how we are being manipulated, but at the same time, what we can do to actually hear or
Yeah.
or behave differently and again at scale. I'd be grateful to hear.
That's a great question. So how to address this conundrum about the place and people I'm from being manipulated, and just the conversation we've had up to now, what is the solution for those who might have some power to improve it? I think two things. One starts with language. I'm a writer, and I believe that words are so powerful. And I challenge everyone in here to resist the term Trump country. And I challenge you also to resist the terms red state and blue state. I think they're very destructive by rendering invisible a lot of people, and also kind of pitting us against ourselves as a country. The other thing, and this might be more to your question, would be to expand our concept of diversity to include socioeconomic class. Now, this aspect of identity, of course, absolutely intersects with race, gender, and a host of other aspects of identity, but I think it deserves to be brought consciously into direct attention, particularly in the context of a place where we have been telling ourselves by way of the so-called American dream that we don't have a class structure in this country. So it's a very important corrective to always have, so me as a member of the news media, and I was a professor for some years, these, like the spaces of a college campus or a newsroom, often there are very well-intentioned people who want to diversify the voices and the access to those places, but they still have a great blind spot about class, and we saw that play out in the way that the 2016 election was covered, perhaps. Thank you.
Yes.
Sarah, thank you for sharing your story. And I work in the New York City public school system, and I'm also a doctoral student. My research involves children's narratives, trying to get them to share their experience about their experience in schools. But I'm really struggling with getting that qualitative data recognized as real data, those stories recognized as something that we should be thinking about in education, when quantitative data and testing is the big thing. So what advice would you have in getting that value?
So how do we give value to the qualitative experience in a world that really, in many ways, privileges statistics and hard numbers? I love this question because I didn't know I was going to end up being a reporter about class, but somehow I almost changed my major from English to economics when I was in college. I took like a couple of like intro-level economics classes to fill out my general requirements, and it just lit me up. And I've always liked math, but I did find that in the course of my journalism career, I started as a hard news reporter at daily newspapers when they still like existed in a robust way across the country, and I found that the way that I was taught to tell stories in journalism school had immense value in conveying information, but information just hits people's minds, and then their own biases do what they will with it. The only way that we ever affect change, as far as I'm concerned, well, politics is famously an emotional and irrational business, isn't it, in terms of people's voting habits? So while I am a defender of the fact and objective realities, I do understand that the way that the human creature works is through story. And so, I think that will, I happen to think that your question intersects a bit with some of the more patriarchal foundations of our society. Often I find that the female experience, when we're lacking in numbers for lack of research to validate it, then we come along telling stories that are easily discounted, and conveniently so. So it's a very complicated challenge to surmount, but I say keep waving the flag for the qualitative for sure.
Any other? One or two more. Oh gosh, how about over there? Yes, in the classes, I think. Yes.
I just have a question about, you mentioned the power of education and also the lack of socioeconomic diversity in these institutions. I wanted to know if you ever felt stifled by institutions like Columbia or Harvard, and what you did to negotiate.
So did I, coming from where I do, ever feel stifled within the more rarefied spaces I've been privileged to cross, like Harvard and Columbia? I definitely, particularly as a very young woman, when maybe I didn't quite know how to handle these things yet, encountered what I would describe as just raw classism. An earlier question addressed the kind of like making fun of a place, and I would, be the recipient of that firsthand once in a while. And that was painful when I hadn't quite solidified my own identity to not care so much. But I have to say that more so than that was an unfortunate and inevitable experience of those experiences. But more so than that, I just encountered generous, good, kind people wherever I go. So when I was recently held the research fellowship at Harvard, you would think like, if there was somewhere where the story I'm peddling would be suspicious, or someone might have a snobbish attitude toward me, I just received overwhelming support and genuine belief in what I'm up to. So I think that that is just an inevitable, and there are parallels, of course, for any other identity marker that somehow sets someone at a disadvantage, and we navigate them. But what I try to do is find the people who are on my side, and it turns out they exist everywhere. Thanks.
Any final questions? Oh, in the back. Yes.
Thank you both so much for being here. Chelsea's father and his background has come to mind to me a lot in terms of the poignance and importance of education and options. Do you think that in the generation that has come to be since you graduated high school and went on to have future studying and reading, do you think that social media and different things have damaged what might have been space that more rural parts of the country or rural upbringings previously gave kids to read, to learn, to write? And do you think that there are any initiatives really within the public school systems in places where now social media has taken up what used to be like an imagination space for kids? Do you think that there's any conscientiousness about that? And have you seen a change in young people from your generation to the next?
Yeah. Thank you. So how has the rural experience changed now with the younger generation and this digital world we live in, and that relates to school and the internet and all sorts of things. So for me, I sense that there has been a regrettable shift toward kind of branding the idea of rural, and that's largely been done artfully by conservative forces. There's a passage in my book that talks about how, what country meant to us when I was coming up. There was nothing self-aware about it, and sometimes I slopped the hogs wearing tennis shoes. I didn't have to perform my cowboy boots, you know what I mean? But today it does feel, and I think it's because of the self-awareness that a child in that same place would now have. Oh, I'm somehow rare in the American experience now for slopping the hogs, and that can come with either pride or shame, which are kind of two sides of the same coin. So I think the big shift for the personal experience is maybe just a greater awareness of one's place in the pecking order. Never in a million years did I think I was poor when I grew up, folks. I usually had enough to eat, always had a roof, and the way I was raised, that was enough. And there was something quite beautiful about that. And that might be lost now, because I would have been the kid that would have been researching everything I could get a hold of online. As far as programs and policy working on rural America and its progress, that's definitely going on. Actually, in a few days, I'm going to be in Washington talking to Senate Democrats at their annual Rural Summit. And so I do think I'm heartened by an increased attention to those spaces by well-meaning politicians.
Well, thank you all for your questions, and thank you for coming today. I hope that all of you will read Heartland. I hope that you will share it with your friends. Clearly, I think that Sarah's family's story deserves to be heard, and then we all need to ask ourselves kind of the questions that it brings up that relate inevitably to class and privilege, but also to place and home. And if that's not sufficiently persuasive, hopefully kind of you can leave here thinking about kind of the beginning of our time together when Sarah read. She is a beautiful writer, so it is an important story. It is also wonderfully told. So hopefully you think it's relevant, but even if not, hopefully you'll think it's a good yarn. I am so grateful that Sarah spent this time with all of us today. I'm always proud and grateful to be in the Housing Works space, and just am so thankful to now be part of Sarah's cheering squad. So would you please end with a round of applause for Sarah Smarsh.
Thank you all so much.
So if you'd like to buy a book and get it signed, that's going to take place just to the right of the stairs. You can form a lovely, polite line and purchase a book, and Sarah will sign it for you. If not, please feel free to browse the store, enjoy our food and our drinks and everything that we have here. And thank you so much for coming, everyone.
Thank you, Rosie.